Chapter 6, The Crushing Blow, covering the years 1925 to 1927. Growing up next to a moonshine operation distorted William Branham's view of the opposite sex. Many times he watched married women slip into the shed after dark to carouse all night with men who were not their husbands. By morning, these women would often be so drunk that the men would give them coffee and walk them in circles, trying to sober them up enough so that they could stagger home to cook breakfast for their families. Such behavior disgusted Billy. He thought, if that's the way they are, I wouldn't have one of the varmints if they lawed me to one. As a result of this negative exposure, Billy grew up to hate any social event that might bring him in contact with girls. Whether it was a birthday party or a barn dance, Billy went to great lengths to avoid it. At the first hint of festive preparations, he would note the time and place and make sure he was busy somewhere else at the appointed hour. Occasionally his mother and father invited the neighbors over for a rousing shindig. On those nights Billy would take his lantern and his dog and plunge into the backwoods, hunting raccoons and opossums for half the night. When he would finally come home, if the musicians were still sawing away on their fiddles, Billy would climb to the top of the woodshed and sleep until daylight. Quitting school did not solve any of Billy's problems, it only rearranged them. He still had to struggle with constant rejection. Most of the local boys didn't like him because he wouldn't smoke or drink, and the girls didn't like him because he wouldn't go to dances and parties. No one understood him. What was worse, Billy didn't understand himself. Even though he liked people and longed to be accepted by them, he couldn't bring himself to act like the other boys his age. He thought, well, if I have to be an outcast, then I'll be a trapper. When I get to be of age and can get enough money somewhere to help take care of my mother, I'll go to Colorado or Washington State, or maybe up into British Columbia, and I'll be a trapper. I'll take my rifle and traps and get me a bunch of dogs, and I'll live there until I die, and I'll never get married. Billy always considered his mother whenever he made long-range plans. It distressed him that she suffered so many hardships because of his father's low life. By the time she was 30, she was the mother of 8 boys, the oldest being 15. There was never enough money, never enough clothes, and often there was not enough food. Billy had seen her sit crying on the doorstep with a baby in her arms, locked out of her own house, while Charles lay inside, drunk and unconscious the whole night. And yet through it all, Ella Branham had lived true to her husband and continually struggled to keep her family clothed, fed, and as happy as possible. Billy loved her for her decency, but even more he loved her because she accepted him just as he was, with all of his peculiarities included. He felt she deserved more from life, and he considered her welfare to be part of his responsibility. Her example gave Billy hope that there were other decent women in the world. Around 1926, a new girl moved into town, developing a friendship with Jimmy Poole's girlfriend. Since Jimmy and Billy chummed a lot, Billy bumped into this new girl at Jimmy's house. Her beauty dazzled him. He thought she had eyes like a dove, teeth as white as pearls, and a neck as graceful as a swan's. When Jimmy introduced him to her, the girl fluttered her eyes and said coquettishly, "How do, Billy?" That was it. Billy was hooked. Later, Jimmy played the part of go-between. "I think she likes you, Billy." Billy melted inside. "You think so?" "Sure she does. Tell you what, why don't we go on a double date? We'll take them for a ride in my dad's old Ford, that is, if I can get the thing started." "I don't know," Billy said nervously. "Sure, we'll have a great time, but we'll need some cash. How much money can you scrape up?" Billy hesitated, then decided that if this gorgeous girl really did like him, he ought to splurge. "I've got 30 cents. That pleased Jimmy. "Good, I've got 35 cents. That should be enough. Besides gas, we've got to get them some soft drinks or ice cream or something." Billy had an idea that might throw him into better light with this girl. "Tell you what, Jimmy, why don't you do the drivin' and I'll do the buyin'?" "Sounds okay to me." They had to jack the back wheels off the ground and hand-crank the engine a dozen times before the old Model T kicked over. The sun had set by the time they picked up their girls. Billy and his date sat in the back seat. Bashful as ever, Billy scooted as far as he could to one side, while she sat on the other. He hoped that the space between them and the darkness would hide his shabby clothes. With the top down, they chugged along the moonlit country lanes, going no place in particular. In the front seat, Jimmy and his girlfriend were doing all the chattering. Billy sat quietly, sneaking glimpses at his date. He thought how radiant she looked in the moonlight, and his heart swelled with pride to think that such beauty would go out with him. Maybe girls weren't all bad. She looked his way and smiled. "It's a pretty night, isn't it?" Billy said, "Yes, ma'am." "There's a dance tonight at the Sycamore Garden," she said. "Let's go down there." Billy stiffened. "No, ma'am. I don't think I want to. I don't dance." They wandered around the countryside for a while longer until they came to a roadside grocery store. Billy and Jimmy had it all planned out what they were going to do. Billy cleared his throat. "Jimmy, I'm kind of thirsty. Don't you think we ought to stop?" "Good idea, Billy." Jimmy stepped out front and then said, "I'll go in and get us something to eat and drink." This, too, was staged because Jimmy didn't even have a penny in his possession. They'd spent 25 cents on 2 gallons of gas, leaving 40 cents, which Billy had nestled in his pocket. Billy said, "Never mind, Jimmy, I'll go get it." The sandwiches cost a nickel apiece, 4 big ham sandwiches smothered with onions. Billy had just enough money left to buy 4 Cokes. They ate in the car, enjoying the sound of the crickets and the cool night air. Billy was feeling good. This girl actually liked him. Tonight he was part of the gang, a real somebody. They finished their Cokes, and Billy took the glass bottles inside the grocery to get his deposit refunded. When he came back, the 3 of them were sitting in the car smoking. Billy could scarcely believe his eyes. His date, that pretty little girl, smoking a cigarette. She tilted her head back, blowing smoke out through her nose. Billy sickened. He climbed in the back seat and plopped down heavily. His girl asked, "Do you want a cigarette, Billy?" "No, ma'am," he said sullenly. "I don't smoke." She looked peeved. "Billy Branham, what is the matter with you? First you tell me you don't dance. Now you tell me you don't smoke. What do you like to do?" "I like to hunt and fish." "How dull." She drew up her upper lip in disgust. "Here, Billy, smoke this cigarette and liven up your life." "No, ma'am, I don't believe I want to do it." "You mean to tell me we girls have got more nerve than you do?" she sneered. "Why, you big sissy." Sissy! That horrible word hurt worse than if a beaver trap had snapped shut on his ankle. Sissy! Pain seared through his heart. Sissy? Not him. He was Big Bad Bill, the hunter, the trapper, the fighter. Sissy? He would show her. "Hand me a cigarette," he ordered. Smugly she tapped one from the pack and handed it over. Billy said, "Give me a match." "Now that's more like a man," she said, and handed him a match. Billy struck the match and lifted both match and cigarette towards his mouth at the same time, one in each hand. But before the cigarette touched his lips, he heard a noise. It sounded like leaves swirling in the wind. He lowered the cigarette and listened intently. He couldn't hear it any more. He thought, "Aw, that's just my imagination." His girl asked, "What's the matter, Billy?" He shook his head. "Nothing. I'm just trying to light it." Again he raised the cigarette towards his mouth. Again he heard that sound, louder this time. A low, steady wind, rising, growing more forceful until it was roaring in his ears. Whoosh! His hands froze halfway to his mouth. His mind flashed back to that deep voice in the poplar tree, warning, "Don't ever drink, or smoke, or defile your body in any way. There will be a work for you to do when you get older." His hands began to tremble. The match burned up to his fingers, and he dropped it. Then he dropped the cigarette. He started to cry. The girl snickered. "Now I know you're a sissy." Angry, frustrated, and scared, Billy pushed open the car door, jumped out, and started walking down the road, still crying. Jimmy drove up beside him. "Come on, get in, Bill." Billy shook his head. "No, Jimmy," and just kept on walking. Jimmy putted alongside, urging him to get in the car, but at the same time Billy's date was mocking him unmercifully. "Billy Branham, you great big sissy. I thought you was a man." Billy sobbed. "I thought I was too," and he turned off the road, cutting across a field where the car could not follow. He walked mechanically until he was over a hill out of sight of the road. Then he hunched down on the ground, sobbing to the moon. "I'm not fit for nobody. I can't have friends. I'm a black sheep among the boys. Nobody likes me. What am I living for? What is the use? Oh, if there was some way I could die here and end it all. I'm a prisoner to this strange something, and I don't know what to do." He sobbed until his emotions were spent. Then he just sat there, staring at the moon, feeling as dead as that lifeless ball of rock out in space. Suddenly he felt something strange, like a pressure pushing against his skin. He had this uncanny perception that he was not alone. Holding his breath, he carefully listened. No sound could be heard. He looked all around him in a field awash with moonlight. There was no one in sight, and yet Billy sensed that someone or something was standing very close to him. A chill inched up his spine. Terrified, he took off running for home. Such experiences let Billy know that his life differed from the ordinary in more ways than just poverty. Strange incidents kept popping up to torment him, like the time he brushed into a fortune-teller. He and Jimmy Poole were at a carnival strolling down the midway, listening to the barkers extolling the virtues of the various games and exhibits. The two boys walked past a fortune-teller's tent. Outside the tent flap stood a young gypsy woman. "Say you," the gypsy called out, "come here a minute." Both boys turned around. "You with the striped sweater," she added. Billy was the one wearing a striped sweater. He walked over to the fortune-teller, thinking that perhaps she wanted him to get her a Coke and a sandwich. "Yes, ma'am, what can I do for you?" She said, "Do you know that there's a light following you?" That struck Bill as an odd thing to say. "A light? What do you mean?" She explained, "I see you were born under a sign, 3 major planets in conjunction in your first house, and they're all squaring Neptune, very deep. That's why there's a light following you. You were born for a divine call." Billy spooked. "Look, woman, shut up," he snapped, and he got away from there fast. Later he told his mother about it. She said, "Billy, you did the right thing. Those fortune-tellers are of the devil." That bothered him. Why would someone so obviously connected with the devil single him out as having, what did that gypsy call it, a divine call? Unable to understand himself, Billy grew more and more dissatisfied with his situation. Why did he always seem to be an odd duck who could not fit in with his peers? And home was no refuge either. Although Charles had by now moved his family out of the cabin on Mr. Wathan's property and into a larger house on the outskirts of Jeffersonville, life at home was still cramped and chaotic. In August of 1927, Ella Branham had her 9th child, James Donald. That made 9 boys, ages 1 to 18, all living and fighting in one house. As always, Billy found his greatest peace by wandering the woodlands with his dog Fritz. Then came the crushing blow. Mr. Short, a local sheriff's deputy, poisoned Fritz with dog glutton. Billy went berserk with hatred. Charles caught his son stomping towards the police station, rifle in hand. "I'm going to kill him, Papa," Billy snarled, quivering with anger. Charles jerked the rifle away from his hot-headed son. "Not if I can help it, you won't." Billy went back to his dog's grave, knelt down, and took off his hat. "Fritz, you've been a friend to me, a real companion. You've clothed me and fed me. You sent me to school. When you got old, I was going to take care of you. But now Mr. Short has killed you before your time. I promise you, Fritz, that he won't live. Someday I'll catch him walking on the street, and I'll run right over him with a car. I'll get him for you." Now that his best friend was gone, Billy felt the need for a change in his life more than ever, so he crossed the river to Louisville, Kentucky, and signed up for the Navy. When he told his mother that night, she was furious. The next morning she marched over to the Navy recruiting office and persuaded them to strike her son's name from their roster. Billy realized that if he was going to make a drastic move, he should do it secretly. Later that fall, he got his chance. He knew a man named Francisco who was getting ready to drive out west to Phoenix, Arizona. Billy mentioned that he planned on going west himself someday. Mr. Francisco took the hint and asked Billy to go with him, even offering to pay him if he would help drive on the 2,000-mile car trip. Billy snatched up the offer, and soon they were ready to leave. Billy told his mother he was going to camp out for a week or two at Tunnel Mill. That way he could leave town without her trying to talk him out of it. When he got to Arizona, he would write her a letter and explain.